Greetings, everyone from London. Lovely to see you all here today. So I'm going to share my slides. I promise there are not too many of these, but after that very generous introduction, I hope you're not too afraid of a very academic presentation here. What I'd love to do is share a combination of my own background and story and how I've come alongside entrepreneurship and how I've experienced the effects of financial extraction on the kind of demand side of that. And as Melanie says, I've been fortunate to spend quite a lot of time in Silicon Valley itself, but definitely with that Silicon Valley model more generally, over a long career of growth strategy and innovation advice. So I've been both a management consultant and a corporate executive working with a number of incubators in Silicon Valley. So I'll give you some sort of reflections on that and weave in a little bit of the economic theory behind extraction. But as we get this session going, I'm going to baseline a little bit with asking you to perform a simple task for me, if you would please, just to calibrate the discussion. Would you please take a few minutes for me and use the expression the Silicon Valley model as a prompt, and just tell me in the chat window what that calls to mind for you. Ah, yeah, some strong views right out of the gate. This is lovely. Growing quickly, extracting as much as possible in service of VCs. Yep, that's a pretty clear observation. Tech aristocracy. That's a lovely one. We could take a nice diversion on that. But very definitely, right. Silicon Valley is strongly associated with high technology and high growth businesses, and there's a certain gloss around that particular subject matter. Exponential growth, getting rich fast, growth over everything. Yep, absolutely. Lean startup is an interesting observation because, again, that's been really part of the Silicon Valley story for the last 10 or 15 years, and trying to encourage a lot more entrepreneurial activity because of the low cost to actually get started. So pretty useful there. Yeah, tech as the solution to everything. Yeah, we definitely had some observations about the tech bro culture in the morning session as well. And so that's definitely a part of it. And I don't think the Silicon Valley model necessarily brings out the best in the male among us. Yeah, lovely. Yeah, there's a lot of story of sort of wealth capture here, and even perhaps intergenerationally. Yeah, lovely. Thank you. All very helpful stuff. Yeah, there's a great deal of kind of negative branding associated with Silicon Valley as a place and as a cultural stereotype. And of course, the Silicon Valley model applies to wherever this kind of activity is happening. But having lived there for 15 years, I'm in no position to tell you that any of your observations are wrong. I want to tell you a little bit about my story just to kind of illustrate some of this. But what I hope happens by the end of this session is that you have a clearer idea of what financial extraction is, though it's clear from the chat that many of you already do. That you have an idea of the role that financial extraction plays in startup funding and encouraging all of these kind of negative behaviors. And also, as a result, be able to question the role of forced growth on founders of startups and the economy. So we are going on a unicorn hunt, but we're going to do so in a non-fatal way. So a little bit about my story. This is the last office that I worked in Silicon Valley. It's in Palo Alto. This was at the end of a 15-year stint for me in Silicon Valley. Most of that time I spent helping corporate startups get funded through incubators. So at Xerox PARC and at Comcast, and most recently at Moon Creative Lab, which is a corporate incubator for Mitsui & Company, a very old, diversified Japanese conglomerate that is invested in a large number of pretty dirty upstream industries. So lots of mineral extraction, lots of steel production, lots of cement and chemicals. And they recognize not only the environmental impact of all of those businesses, but the fact that they're becoming increasingly regulated out of business. So the strategic rationale for Mitsui in having a corporate incubator is to create the embryonic new lines of business of tomorrow. And of course, the difference between a startup scale and a line of business for a giant company like Mitsui is so wide that it's actually much more likely that the startups that we created would be spun out, once they got to a point of needing more capital than we could provide them. They probably wouldn't be at the scale of revenue that a business unit leader would want to adopt and continue to have on the cost side of his books. So the incubator's role then was to search for and create startups that could grow rapidly and generate significant value for Mitsui. As you see, they provided richly for us. We had a budget of $30 million a year, which we spent, partly on our wonderful studios in Palo Alto and Tokyo. But we spent a good deal of that money funding the startups themselves to a tune of perhaps $200,000 to $500,000 each a year for about a dozen startups in our portfolio. So there was quite a lot of corporate budget going into this. As you can see, the facilities are lovely, and the atmosphere relaxed and inspiring. Great place to work, really. And the dark secret behind all of this really is financial extraction, because ultimately these are digital businesses that we're trying to grow very, very quickly to get them to a point where we can exit in the same way a venture capitalist would exit their investment in startups. In other words, we needed profitable spin-out businesses that returned an ROI on Mitsui's investment in them that was at least equivalent to the ROI they expected on typical capital investments in the traditional lines of business. So what that meant was that we put them through a very intensive program. We grew them very quickly, and we got them to a point where we could either spin them out or sell them off to another company. And in that process, of course, the founders, who all came from the parent company, they all had a great experience, building things, testing things, going out to understand customer needs. But they ended up with very, very little, true equity in the business, and in many cases they ended up, needing to quickly retrench and bring their costs back in line with revenues once we spun them out. So that's just a little bit of my background to illustrate, some of those dynamics in place. And perhaps why for those, certainly on the supply side of incubation, it's a pretty attractive and comfortable deal. A little bit more about financial extraction in there, though. You'll have heard me say that we sold those businesses and sort of either kept the equity of those businesses in exchange for the revenue streams, or we sold them off. This is essentially what extraction means. It's the capture of financial surpluses by the owners of capital, in this case, the parent company behind the incubator. So this is the economics bit. So bear with me here. This whole sort of logic chain around how the venture funded entrepreneurship business came about really happens because, at least historically, and it's still true to a certain extent, production lags investment. This was an observation that Keynes made in the 1930s. And what he's basically saying is, if you want to generate revenue, if you want to create products, you've got to invest upstream of that, originally to build factories and water mills and hire laborers and train them and design a product and build a factory. And then sometime downstream, you would get a return on that. So that very dynamic of time shifting between the investment and the generation of value creates the opportunity for a lending function. And, of course, businesses have always borrowed to fund the acquisition of the means of production. And ultimately, that took the form of the credit business as we know it today. So, over time, this was an observation of Rosa Luxemburg. She was an economist who was very critical of capitalism and also Marxism, as it happened. She had a lot of disagreement with most of the models available at the time she made her study, but she observed that seeking surpluses from the production of businesses became a business in itself. So it was possible to disconnect the capture of financial surpluses from the creation of real value. And she observed that this really happened when we stopped being, an agrarian society living in villages where, by definition, you would only ever produce as much as everybody needed to eat. And once sort of businesses started trading over longer distances with communities they didn't know, that's when it became possible for the owners of capital to start seeking these surpluses as a return in itself. So not just interest as we know it, for sort of rewarding someone for giving up current consumption for future consumption, but really quite significant surpluses became a target of the owners of capital. So then here's sort of how it plays out graphically for a VC-funded startup. The startup has a great idea. It's this wonderful egg, and they take an investment from a VC, which critically gives that egg a value. It gives it a valuation that is based more on the investment, which has some linkage to potential future real revenues, but it's so difficult to establish that valuation is often far exceeds the true potential of the business. And it's certainly not based on any sort of fundamentals like real revenue. So you've got a business with a valuation. And so what happens next is, the VC investors push that startup to grow. I'm showing you a hothouse here to show rapid plant growth rather than, battery chicken farming, because there really aren't any pleasant pictures of that I could share with you. But so forgive the shift of analogy from eggs to plants. What the investors want out of this process is a liquidity event like the ones that my team was chasing at the incubator. They want an IPO or a sale to another company that gives them a good return. So the process that the startup is usually put through is an incubation program in which the startup uses its investment to start expansion. It starts hiring more people, building an R&D team, hiring UX designers, hiring salespeople, to get to work exploring its value proposition, developing its concept, and trying to get closer to market. All of the things that it wanted to do, but now it's under pressure to do it quickly. So the interesting thing that's happening at this sort of period is that costs are expanding much faster than revenues, if revenues are expanding at all. But the investors generally don't care about this. It's actually good for them, because the more the startup kind of takes as investment, the higher the valuation of the equity of that startup can be said to be. So obviously the investors are looking for milestones, the creation of product prototypes, the acquisition of first customers and revenue. But each one of those stages allows the story of valuation growth to get richer and richer. And as we go through this cycle, of course, more investors are attracted in off the back of that valuation story. And of course, the burn rate continues because the company is trying to use that money to expand. So every one of these milestones sort of encourages further investment and increasing valuation. And long before we might actually have revenues that are compatible with that valuation, what you end up with is a unicorn, or as Melanie likes to characterize it, a uni-chicken. So we're back to the chicken analogy here. What this is a high value company that's emerged from incubation, with a high valuation and ready for market. So this is when the investors want to capture their gains. And so a shorter period of time from egg to uni-chicken suits the investors really well. And they'll often then at this point, float the shares through an IPO or sell out to another company, essentially based on a valuation that remains a promise of future potential. So if the story of market growth and unit economics is strong enough, then they'll be able to make a sale. And most people here know of, all of the highly valued technology companies that the great and good of Silicon Valley, like Meta and Google and Amazon and Apple, have all bought, not all of which, turned out to be really successful investments. Partly because things really change for the uni-chicken at this point, right? It's got a new owner, but the gravy train stops. Now that the investors have cashed out and it's got an owner, it's usually because that owner represents a great channel to market. So, there should be some explanation of fit between the uni-chicken's model and the ultimate buyer. And what that buyer wants out of it is the fastest route to profitable revenue it can get. And obviously, it'll help accelerate the product development, but it'll also almost certainly start trying to cut the costs and really put that uni-chicken on a path of profitability. So again, you can end up here with, a retrenchment of costs, some staff being laid off, flashy offices closed down, consolidation with the acquirers, systems and offices. Cisco is particularly well known for kind of making everybody come to campus and, leave the foosball tables behind. And adopt Oracle and all of the kind of corporate tentacles that come with that. So you can quite often end up with essentially a zombie chicken. That's the worst case scenario. It doesn't always happen, but there is often this sort of snapping back from this sky high valuation into something that walks and talks much more like the unit of a slow moving corporation, because it's had this sudden deceleration of the gravy train into a profitability mode. So that's sort of how that extraction model can play out for startups. And it begs the question, why does this happen to startups? And it comes down to just a couple of things. It's entrepreneurial businesses, by their sort of 0 to 1 nature, have really high potential for creating surpluses, right? If you're an owner of capital and you're looking to multiply that many-fold, we often hear, right, that VCs are looking for, depending on the stage they invest, a 10-fold or a 20-fold return on their investment. And to some extent, startups are really the only game in town where that sort of multiplication is possible. Of course, the founders want their ideas to succeed, and initially their incentives align very neatly with the with those of the investors, right? They think that more resources are going to get them more quickly to success. It's going to allow them to hire all the talent they want. But as anybody who's ever worked in a larger organization or even a fast-growing startup will tell you, adding more resources doesn't necessarily multiply the rate of real progress quite as much as you would want it to. And of course, over time, what happens is that the successive rounds of fundraising dilute the founders' equity. And so over time, they end up with less and less direct control over the trajectory and pace of their growth. So their original vision of bringing this wonderful new something to market sort of isn't always within their control. So, again, this is an observation Melanie has made many times before, right? In truth, capital really only accelerates market success if it accelerates profitable revenue. Everything else is really financial extraction. So if there's a close relationship between incremental capital additions and scaling up in a way that turns rapidly into revenue, then it's more like the pump and dump kind of method that this is often described as. So this is one of those, if you like, quasi-academic, sort of wake-up calls around, the extraction behind the VC funding model, and it doesn't always work this disastrously. But I have to say, I've seen an enormous number of corporate acquisitions of startups fail on the altar of not just these sorts of unfavorable economics, but also, of course, the corporate politics that makes it hard for the startup to kind of realize its full potential inside the business. So that's more or less everything I wanted to share. I'm open to questions and comments, of course, but I thought it might be useful if we spent a little time as a group, reflecting on, what problems this model might create for, the economy as a whole. And it's perhaps even clearer to see what might happen to founders. But what are your thoughts? Tell me in the chat or raise a hand and we can have a discussion.
All right, Nikki, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Well, yes, as you were talking, I was thinking that it's not like entrepreneurship or the startup model is equal to kind of this growth and the chicken kind of metaphor that you use. It's that it's been hijacked to look that way. So I think the biggest problem is about the social imaginary and how people conceive of growth and these things through the entrepreneurial story. So I think how we are teaching entrepreneurship, how we're talking about these concepts just makes people believe that this is the best thing that can happen to you, while it's the worst thing that is causing a lot of pain in different parts. And I think from that perspective, this is one of the biggest ways that the Silicon Valley model is harmful.
Yeah, that's very hard to disagree with. And you definitely see an enormous emphasis on creating this equivalence between high valuations and the prospect of founders and employees to get rich as equivalent to creating true worth. And obviously it's society's easiest proxy for success because it's a very useful scorecard in some ways. But yeah, the sort of automatic mapping of worth and true value onto this sort of process has become a little bit shaded by the greed involved, for sure. Yeah, so not good observation. Yeah, Suparna, I see your hand is up too. Do you have an observation for us?
Yeah. What does the VC model do that other alternatives, economic alternatives, don't do? like
Oh,
sources of capital. Yeah, there must be something that beyond this, which I mean, you've answered some of this, but maybe you can like think out loud. What does it do beyond the extraction? What's good about it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm sure among us, we know a number of stories of where early investors have provided, phenomenal guidance, through sitting on boards, kind of networking to skills, introducing startups to founders, helping them find premises and partners. So there is definitely a social competencies, kind of dimension, I think, that's well worth preserving in all of this. And that I think is good grist for this group to reflect on over the coming weeks, right? Is like, what could we take from that model as worthwhile DNA? And of course, the extractive model is driving a lot of that, because it can be done in service of speeding up the acceleration of inflated valuations, but it could also be put, I think, in service of a kind of a more thoughtful, deliberate, well-being promoted trajectory for post-growth startups. So I feel like there is a lot of social benefit to it as well. And because money in our system tends to attract skills, there is certainly a kind of a way of pointing startups at great skills. But of course, it only values their contribution in terms of the salaries they can command. So it doesn't always lead to great allocations there either. But yeah, there are definitely some bits and pieces, and I think that's worth further reflection.
You want to respond to some of the comments in the chat, Jeremy?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and there's definitely a little bit of horror, a sort of a reflection that this is a Frankenstein model is not entirely inappropriate, it seems to me, because there is this sort of almost like deliberate forgetting of some of the negative social consequences of this model in our continued championing of growth above everything as a fix for every social ill we have, even though it's very clear that capitalism as a whole, and certainly the startup ecology, goes through these really painful cycles of almost like economic bulimia, right, of sort of gorging on capital and then sort of struggling with deflation. It's like we've forgotten how to reflect on that a little bit. And I think some of the observations about what it does for founders, right, sort of the demoralization effect of seeing your work sort of picked over and returned, right, kind of reduced to its bones, which is a lovely expression. We tend to forget the losses and sort of move on. I think Suparna probably knows that that's not always the case in the corporate world, right? Where your failures, often follow you in a career sense for longer than is supposed to be true in the startup world. I think there's a strong sense in the chat that this is really kind of bringing out the worst in people in terms of what we choose for our motivations and incentives. So I also think that it's worth this group reflecting on what are better metrics, what are better sort of outcomes that we want to chase and start targeting, because the VC world obviously has a rich set of metrics for evaluating success, and that's what drives the behavior, right? So if we had different metrics that would allow us to maybe uncompress time a little bit, or seek broader measures of well-being among all of the participants of post-growth startups, that might cause us to invest differently and more broadly. But definitely takes a focus on that kind of stuff. Yeah. Well, let's keep the conversation going for sure. But I just wanted to end with, just a couple of takeaways. I think of extraction as artificial forcing of a startup's valuation, driven by the desire of investors to have a profitable exit, regardless of whether there's a viable business, at the point of sale or afterwards. And it comes from how capital became a business in its own right, seeking as its outcomes the acquisition of the most attractive surpluses for the least effort, right? And startups seem to be very fair game for this. And again, I think everybody's made this observation in different ways that sort of endless growth is not natural, right? It's trees don't grow forever. All living organisms have a life cycle, and they stop growing at a certain point, and then they live their mature life, generally speaking, at the same size, consuming the same resources and producing the same output. And until they decline. And we simply don't think of businesses as having any sort of natural lifespan. And of course, zombie companies don't always have to be just the new ones. There are lots of sort of stories of zombie companies, hanging around long past their really useful life. But of course, the resources they've been able to hoard often allows them to sort of keep going too long. So yeah, in pursuit of shrinking this waste and producing a healthier model of more broadly durable companies doing more good in the world, I think the model is well overdue for reframing. So yeah, I by all means let's keep the conversation going in the chat or afterwards. You can catch me on the contact list, and I love talking about this stuff. So thank you very much for your attention and engagement, and look forward to the rest of the session.
Thanks, Jeremy. Before we move on, can you just answer that last question from Suparna?
Oh yeah, right. Oh yeah, no, great question. Yeah, in the chat. So what made me change my perspective? Interesting, really. Slowly, then quickly. That's how it happened. So slowly over the past 5 years, I was feeling that the ratio of, kind of worthless but scalable and therefore potentially valuable businesses to worthwhile businesses in the portfolios I was helping to fund and grow was just becoming very unfavorable, sort of fairly low grade derivative social networks, sort of, internet connected doodads, sort of all these kinds of, and so I got this sense that there were all sorts of brilliant minds working on, kind of literally hard technologies like, chemical innovations and, battery storage and metamaterials and sensing everywhere, but they were being put to these fairly banal and derivative uses just because you can put the Lego together and you can make a business case. So it's a combination in the sort of last 5 years of that sort of easy money, making it a fairly simple sort of process to fund, pretty, uninteresting businesses. And of course the availability of all the cheap technologies themselves. And then that started me thinking about whether the sort of pursuit of growth and my role in sustaining it was a good thing. So, I started reading me some Kate Raworth, some Mariana Mazzucato, some Tim Jackson. And that led me to quit my job and go back to school. So that brought me back to the UK from Silicon Valley, and I had a really kind of delicious sabbatical at the hands of the likes of Tim Jackson in Surrey last year, where I got to meet Melanie. So yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to properly atone for my role in this mess. By hopefully using some of the skills of sort of strategy making and advising startups, against a more positive mission. That's the hope right now. Yeah, but thanks for the question, Suparna. It's great. Yeah. Never too late, right, for growth.
Personal growth, that is.
Yes, exactly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was really awesome.
Very welcome.
Thank you so much for taking the time.